Well, thank you very much, Professor Robertson. Thank you for this invitation. There's nothing that I like better than being able to talk with young people, professionals like you, who will be the ones taking the next steps. So thank you for coming today. And this is going to be a very informal, I prepared it, of course, conversation, but I really want you to feel very comfortable about asking me questions and as we work through. It's very exciting to be asked to talk about the Colombian-US relationship because it is really long-standing and positive. We will be celebrating 200 years of our diplomatic relationship next year in May, and are planning to do something very, very, very special. Because what's really interesting is Simón Bolívar, when he was in the process of trying to get our independence, was very inspired by the US, by your fight for independence, by your Declaration of Independence, so much so that he sent a diplomatic attaché in 1818. We did not get our liberty from Spain till 1819, but in 1818 he already had somebody in Washington to get the support of Washington. For us, it was very important that the US support us. And so in the 7th of August of 1819, we were liberated from the Spaniards. And in 1821, we had diplomatic relations between the US and Colombia. But all those years, we always had a very, very constant conversation to try and learn and incorporate into our new constitution so many of the premises that were so fundamental to your Declaration of Independence. And then we've gone along this path together of defense of democracy throughout different periods. In fact, when there was the war in Korea, Colombia signed up to go to Korea. We're the only Latin American country, and we went and fought with the US. And we were there to defend democracy. When there was the Cuba Missile Crisis, and the US was seeking a way to address this great problem, Colombia, we had a president, Alberto Lleras, who had been fundamental both in the conversations in San Francisco for the United Nations and also in transforming the Pan American Union into the OAS. He worked with President Kennedy in looking at a multilateral, a regional response to Cuba, and were able to get the support which led to excluding Cuba from the American system because they had abandoned their democratic ideals and had adopted the Soviet model. Then, being here in the Bush School, how could I not share with you how important President Bush 41 was for Colombia? My father was president in 1986 to 1990. That was a terrible time of the drug trafficking in Colombia. That is a terrible time of Pablo Escobar. And we were, for our democracy and for our countries, this was a real challenge. My father had been elected to come in. He wanted to fight against poverty. That was he had been in public service his whole life, and this is what he wanted to do. But when he got in, he found that the greatest threat that there was what the drug traffickers were trying to do. As they became more powerful economically, they thought they could impose their will and do whatever they wanted by threatening, by violence. And so my father took a very, very strong stand, adopted the extradition, would extradite them here to the US, and this is the way we started addressing these concerns. But it was a very difficult moment. President Bush at that moment also realized that the war on drugs was a problem not only of the producing countries, but of the consuming countries, because it is the consumption that drives the production. And he came up with a policy to address both of these issues and presented it, and decided that he would go to Colombia, that there would be a summit in Cartagena in 1990, February 1990, and he would invite the presidents of Peru, which was Alan Garcia, of Bolivia, who was Paz Zamora, and meet with the host, which was Virgilio Barco, and talk about what this meant for our countries. And this was a decision that I understand in talking with people who were with President Bush at that moment, who felt that it was such a dangerous trip to make that they really sort of tried to suggest that it was not a good idea for the president to come, that he could send a very high-level emissary, but not himself. And he was the one who said he needed to come and wanted to come. They had this conversation, and as a result of that conversation, there was when the Bush administration asked Congress to pass a free trade. It was a trade tariff preference system for the Andean countries so that we could send our products tariff-free in order to move our economies and, in a way, create strengthen crops that could be used for crop substitution. So President Bush 41 is very dear to Colombia, and it was instrumental in changing this whole view, which President Barco in that same year at the United Nations had called for shared responsibility, because this is a problem where consumers, producers, those countries that produce the chemicals that are needed to make the cocaine all have a role to play. And with this new international war, it was important that we all be together and fighting together. Then that takes us now to what I wanted to talk in my presentation today. Fast forward with this, we're talking about 1990. Colombia, the drug trafficking continues to increase. So by the end of 1998, that President Pastrana had tried to reach a peace agreement with the FARC. For 2 years, he separated an area as large as Switzerland to where there was demilitarized so that they could sit down and have a conversation. The FARC never sat down. And so in the end, when President Uribe was elected in 2002, once again, the guerrilla was back and fighting, and we knew that the country was under siege. It was a time when people talked about a country that might be failing. If you ask us, we never felt we were failing because we've had the longest standing democracy in Latin America, but it was a country that was suffering great threats. So I'm going to move into that presentation. I always want to start with this lovely face. This is a group that from a town called Palenque near Cartagena. And I think she radiates what Colombians are. I think Colombian people are open, are friendly, a wonderful smile, and we want to make you feel very, very welcome. We're colorful, we have wonderful music, and so I always like this as a way to start. So let's just remember quickly about Colombia. How many of you have been to Colombia? No Colombia. Okay. So this is almost, you could do this presentation for me, but just very quickly, for those who don't know, what's very interesting from Colombia is the fact that we have access to the Caribbean and to the Pacific. I don't know why in this map we're missing, it's sort of on its own. The area, the land area, just for people to get a feel, is sort of Texas and California. And what's interesting in Colombia, as we'll see, is that we have a mountain range down the middle, down to one side, and that's where most of our population is. So in trying to make this graphic, I would say all of our people lived in California, and then they had this beautiful Texas, which was uninhabited. It's the most biologically diverse country in the world after Brazil. And there's a difference in the size, but we have such a diverse geography. That's what's led to that situation. Third largest population of Latin America with 48 million. We're probably closer to 49. And most of it urban. GDP of $5,322, and the oldest and most stable democracy committed to a market democracy. And we have a FTA that we have with the US since 2016. So this is why we are such a biodiverse country, because when the Andes comes into Colombia, it divides into three. So in three different ranges, it goes from sea level to 18,000 feet, comes down, up again, and here we have the Magdalena River, which is like our vertebrae and the backbone, and then we go up again, have the Cauca River, go up again, and this then would be this mountainous area where most of our cities and most of our development is here and in this area. Here we have the Pacific, which is one of the places in the world that has the most rainfall. So it is a very, very dense tropical rainforest. This is the Caribbean, which are more like grasslands, but with a snow-covered mountain that goes out from the Caribbean up to 18,000 feet. And this is a desert. Then we come down, and this is grassland. This is called the Llanos, and all this is the Amazon. I want to show you not only for the biodiversity, but to understand Colombia and understand the challenges we have. You have to understand how difficult our geography makes it for building roads and for taking services. So this is why I'm saying that most of the development is here, and we find that along all this hinterland, in a way, state presence is minimal because it's very difficult to get there and requires a lot of investment, which we need to address. Biodiverse, we have, the last information I saw was 56,000 different species. We're number one in birds, number two in reptiles, amphibians, in plants. We're number one in palms, in orchids, etc. So it's a country that is very, very biodiverse. But as I was saying, because of that geography, we have very, very limited connectivity. In fact, even in 2008, Colombia had only 287 kilometers per million inhabitants, as compared even to Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, which just shows how difficult it is. And this is an area where we are investing a lot of our money. We realize that if we don't get our road system going and able to reach the country, we cannot take control of the country because you need to get there. And I show this map because it shows how, when you have these big spaces, well, that is where the illegal activities can go because the state is not present. So the red is where cocaine crops started growing. And they have continued growing a lot along this border. And I want you to remember our border with Venezuela, because this is an area that also has been growing tremendously. Because with the change in the government in Venezuela and the situation, they are very much involved in drug trafficking. So this has become sort of like an open border for flights, for drug trafficking, for the support for illegal groups. So this has become a real problem for us because we have a completely open border. It's a border that has other than some mountains here, it's very easy to cross. So here we see how the cocaine and the guerrillas, the FARC that we had since 1950, that had risen because of political strife between two parties. But when there was a Cuban effort to take over some countries with a communist model, Colombia was one of the places that was chosen. And so since the 1950s, we have had this guerrilla. But this guerrilla had not been growing until the drug trafficking came in. And all of a sudden, there was an incredible resources that would allow them to get more people, better armament. And just to give you an example, what I mean with better armament, when I'll finish my idea. Here I just want to show you what happened between 1998 and 2006. As the cocaine grew, the presence of the FARC grew. At that point, it was this widespread. And this shows the level where there was great, great violence. And so for Colombia, that's why there was this whole idea of, was it a failed state or was it not? And when we talk about the access to weapons they had, when President Uribe was campaigning in 2001, 2002, there were several assassination attempts. And one, they blew up his car in Barranquilla. So the British government said, how can we help you? And he said, could I have a satellite telephone? The FARC had many satellite telephones. The Colombian government did not have one. At that point, there was, the FARC had more access to more arms, access to more technology than we did. So given these circumstances, the conversation got going between President Pastrana and President Clinton, talking about how the US could help this country that had always been next to them, that believed in democracy, and that there was such concern that we might succumb to this, the drug trafficking guerrillas. So the conversation started with President Clinton and President Pastrana, but immediately there was a change in government, and President Uribe came in with President Bush. So here, bipartisan, from a Democrat to a Republican, and in the case of Colombia also, our President Pastrana was a conservative, President Uribe was a liberal, and the conversations continued at the highest level. And that has been one of the things that was very, very important, is the level of the presidents, commitment by the presidents, open communication by the presidents. And the other thing that was very important is the commitment by the Colombian people. The US wanted to see that we were totally committed. When President Uribe came in, our military was so weak, as I was telling you, in technology, etc. In one of the first cabinet meetings, and I was part of his government then, that's when I was foreign minister, he said, we need to help our military. Our military needs, we need to buy it from basically from boots to arms to everything. And so we passed he made a series of calls, and we passed a tax on wealth. Only the wealthy people paid, and that tax continues, but it was accepted immediately, and so that showed that the Colombian people were also willing. And when we look at the results of Plan Colombia, which was very, very generous, there's a feeling that it was all done with American money. In fact, it wasn't. American money was fundamental, and it was fundamental because of what we were able to get from Plan Colombia, which was intelligence and which was mobility, helicopters and planes, because as you saw our geography, that geography, what it required was the ability to move by air and then to spray, which we did, and to fight the drug trafficking. And so that became very important. Our conversations with Congress were always also bipartisan. We had support from Republicans, we had support from Democrats. Once again, when I was ambassador, just to illustrate, I had more than 1,600 meetings on the Hill. 60% probably with Democrats, 40% with Republicans, because it was very important to maintain a communication so that they knew what we were doing. There were always problems. There was concern with human rights. There were different issues. It was very important to address them and to hear what was going on. And so this is the kind of relationship we've always had. More than 91 congressmen went down to Colombia during those 4 years, because you need to get down to see what's going on, and that helps you understand the difficulties, which sometimes are hard to understand unless you're there. And you can also see the progress, and you could also talk to ex-guerrillas and hear them. Why had they gone? Why were they fighting? Many of them is because that was an economic alternative. Many of them is because their father and their brother had been killed and they wanted to go out there and get revenge. So all this helped to understand better what was going on and made the communication much more successful. So we started with $1 billion in the year 2000, and then there's been a standing commitment up to today. So we're almost 20 years of commitment, and that is an important aspect also. What are the main elements that Plan Colombia set out to do? First of all, it was about fighting drug production. That was the way it was first formulated with President Clinton. But slowly, very quickly, with President Bush, President Uribe explained that when we were fighting drugs, basically we were fighting the guerrillas that had become so involved in the drug trafficking because this had become their way of financing their fight. And so there had to be a change in what's called the authorities, the permission to use this money and to use the goods, the planes, for fighting also the narco guerrillas. But two other elements that were very important also in Plan Colombia was the part that had to do with strengthening our institutions, especially justice. Justice was very important. For democracy, you have to have a justice system that is working, that people have faith in. And so we worked very strong on that. And economic development and crop substitution. Give people hope and be able to give them some economic support. What is interesting, and I'm going to show you now how effective this plan was, so that here we see between 2002 and 2013, Plan Colombia starts 2002 really because the first 2 years were sort of setting it up. And so we're going here to 2013. This, remember, was what I showed you was all the FARC areas. By this time, by 2013, they were limited to, they were greatly, greatly reduced, which meant that by the end of, by 2010, 12, 13, most of the leaders of the FARC, the old leaders who were very, very committed to the communist model, had been killed off, were no longer leading, and there was a new generation with whom it was possible for President Santos to have a conversation about reaching a peace agreement. But this was only possible because of the fight that we had had with them and been able to be so successful. And here we see how that improved the country. When I said that we were concerned that we were a failing state, it was because there were more than almost 3,000 kidnappings a year. Kidnappings that it was so terrible that people would not leave the main cities. One of the first things that President Uribe did in 2002, August 2002, he said, by December 2002, you will be able to go to the main cities. But we're talking as though, going from Houston to Dallas, not going to little cities. This was going from Bogota to Medellin, or Medellin to Cali, our major cities. And what he did was make sure that these corridors were secured. And that Christmas, it was a carnival. You could go on these streets, on these roads, for the first time in several years, on your own if you wanted, but if you were worried, you went together as a caravan. Music, balloons, it was a party. And it was very important because it was taking control of our country again. And that was absolutely fundamental. It was giving hope again. Intentional homicides. Once again, you see how from 70 per 100,000, we were one of the most dangerous countries of the world, coming down then to 20 or 17 and 15, and it's continued to go down. And so what did that mean? That our economy started to flourish. And by that time, these are the Latin American countries. We were fourth in Latin America after Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia. We'll have to see what's happening now with all the economic changes. But this is in 2016, I think, is this information. And this was the best result was that because our economy was rising, we were able to decrease our poverty levels, the extreme poverty levels, and our middle class started increasing. And as you all know, having a strong middle class is absolutely fundamental, and that is what is missing in many of our countries where we need to really work on strengthening our middle class. So with all these results, by the year 2012, President Santos comes in. He has a group that does an initial contact with the FARC, and they realize that there is the possibility of sitting down to talk about a peace agreement. And we're talking about 50 years that we'd had this guerrilla. For 4 years, there's a conversation. It takes place in Cuba. Norway is a guarantor, and they decide on 10 different points of the agenda that they need to agree. In these conversations, you go one by one, or you skip, you get the easy ones out of the way first, and you end up with the most difficult. But as you know, in a conversation like this, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So for 4 years, the conversations took place, and when it was agreed on, the President Santos said, we will have a referendum so that people can decide, can support it. There was a group headed by President Uribe who did not, he felt that the country could have gone further in fighting the FARC, and he felt that some of the terms of the peace agreement were too favorable to the guerrilla. So he wanted some changes in the peace agreement, and he had a whole group, he started a campaign, and so when there was the vote, to great surprise, the no won by almost 1%, but it won, the no won. And so President Santos said, I will respect this. We didn't know if the guerrillas were going to get up and leave the negotiating table in Cuba, but they were there they showed the interest they had in reaching an agreement. They stayed there. They renegotiated some of the issues that were on the table. And once again, the agreement was approved by Congress and went into effect in 2017. At that moment, President Santos came to the States, met with President Obama, and they decided that Plan Colombia would become Peace Colombia because we would use these monies to implement the peace agreement, to build the institutions that were required, to help the reincorporation of the guerrillas, and to continue then to take over those areas that belong to the FARC and make them areas that where the government was present. However, one of the issues that we found, this progress was very important, but negotiating a peace agreement is very difficult. Making it work, I would say, is even harder. There you face all the reality of how do you make this work. And I think that both of our governments, the Santos and the Duque, have made a great effort to get the peace agreement going. However, there's one aspect that has made it, that has made it very difficult, which is what in these 10 points that were agreed upon, one was that the government would recognize and pay for all the hectares that were planted in coca at the moment of the agreement. In other words, they would pay for it so that they could be eradicated. And so what happened? This was one of the points that was discussed very early on. So for 2 years, they planted more coca because at the end, that way they would get paid more. So unfortunately, by the time we finished signing the peace agreement, we were almost at the same level of production of coca that we had been when we started Plan Colombia. So this is a great reversal to the progress we had made because we had gotten down to 70,000 hectares and we were up 100,000 more. But, so this is one of the challenges that we found. President Duque has continued with the implementation of the agreement. He calls it peace with legality because he's been working a lot on the different parts that have to do with the whole legality. This is there's a special justice jurisdiction. We had created an agency for reincorporation. Many of these guerrillas couldn't even read and write. They had been always in fighting. Others required certain training. We needed to make sure that they had the ability to sustenance, that they had housing. We had to address all the issues of the victims in Colombia and of all those who had been displaced by getting them back to their houses, by recognizing for the victims, there was compensation, some that were individual, some that were for communities that had to leave. and also a historical memory group to rebuild and understand that history of those years so that we hopefully will not repeat and have that same situation. And we continue to work. And one of the other big challenges was, okay, the FARC have left all these areas where they had control. How can the government take control of that and keep other illegal groups out? Because the FARC left, but the illegal coca plantations were still there. And you have drug traffickers, which were not guerrillas, but just traffickers who were there. And as in any peace agreement, there's always dissidents who leave and go back to the life as guerrillas, because that's what they knew how to do. All their life, they had carried arms. This is what they used to do. So Colombia was faced with a very difficult challenge, which is, as you will remember, this is where the FARC was, this is where the FARC was, etc. But these were also the areas that have very poor communication. So we needed the government to go in quickly and try and take over these areas. However, Colombia is so big and our resources were limited, the government decided then to prioritize 16 subregions and 170 little municipios, work with the communities to get them invested in the democracy so that they would decide which were the projects that they wanted to carry out. And so this is the way we have been working at this issue of trying to take government presence to these different areas, but we continue to have difficulty because, as I was telling you, one, we have illegal drug traffickers in this area. We have dissidents who've gone there, and from all this area in Venezuela, there is a lot of support coming through. So these were the challenges that we continue to work on in Peace Colombia. So we continue getting about 500 million a year, more or less, and these funds are going to especially two of our major issues. One then is working in Peace Colombia in strengthening state presence and fighting the drug production. This year we got 457 million, and this is more or less what has been negotiated. But the other monies that we are getting have to do with the issue of the migrants from Venezuela. As you all know, the situation in Venezuela has deteriorated to such a point that anybody who can get out is leaving because they no longer, they're going hungry. The average person's lost 20 kilos. The malnutrition levels are incredible. The people who've come over to Colombia are coming over with polio, TB, all these sicknesses that no longer existed but that we're facing because they haven't had vaccines. So what Colombia decided to do was to recognize these people and give them a temporary TPS, temporary permanent status, no? Because we feel it makes more sense for them to know that for 10 years they can be in Colombia, they can work in Colombia, they'll get health and education. And at the border, we have an open border a border where people who want to come in and out can to come and get one meal, to be able to go to the doctors, and then they go back. And why do they come and go back? Because for them, the only thing that they have left is a house, a plot of land. If they stay in Colombia, they lose it. So this is why there's still this group of more than 3,000 people who come in daily to get that meal or to get the health. So there we've also been getting help from Colombia, and which shows this incredible path that we have gone on together, where we have made incredible progress, we're finding new challenges, we are addressing these programs. So I would like to end by saying that this is a wonderful example of what the US can do to help a country that's going through very difficult challenges, as you have seen. And there was an analysis done just recently about what were the lessons from Plan Colombia where many of the leaders who were part of it and of the government, US government and Colombian government talked. And it seemed that it was very important to be talking about what the objectives were, but also adjust them. We'd started with drugs, we moved into drug trafficking because that was what we needed to do because it was absolutely related. Then we are now making the adjustments to address the issues that are coming up with peace leadership at the highest level. The commitment of our presidents throughout all these years has been at the highest level, and also with a very, very strong support of Congress. Working with Congress is fundamental. Clearly in the US you have your division of powers. Congress plays an important role, and we respect and work very hard with it. Good and constant communication. John Walters, who was the drug czar, was telling me the other day, every time they went down to Colombia, they could meet with whoever it was, with the president, the minister, go out wherever it was. And there were visits back and forth because you need to have constant communication to work on something that this is complex and where there are issues where sometimes you don't agree and you need to work them out. This bipartisan approach and a medium to long-term commitment. A problem like this is not solved over 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. We have continued to work together. The support is going down, but there's always that commitment that helps us to work on the especially difficult issues, and this has been fundamental. So I would say that Plan Colombia, Peace Colombia, shows our continued strong and productive relationship for which Colombia is absolutely grateful and is a country committed to democracy, committed to continue working with the US. And I think this relationship works for both of our countries. And so thank you very much for listening and sharing, giving me the possibility to share this with you. Thank you very much. This is the other beautiful part of Colombia.
So we could let you moderate the questions yourself. If anyone has questions, go ahead and just raise your hand and we can start a discussion if you like. Yeah.
So what prompted your shift from being the foreign minister to being the U.S. ambassador?
I'm going to give you the very truthful. I've sometimes tried to be more diplomatic. No. So I was ambassador. I was the foreign minister for 4 years, and the President Pastrana, who was in the U.S., decided to go back to Colombia, and President Uribe was very, very interested in our getting the FTA. The trade preferences had been great, but every year we didn't know whether they're going to pass or not going to pass, how long, what would be included, what wasn't. What we really wanted to do was a long-term trade agreement so that our companies, your companies, would invest and we could really have the trade that we wanted. So when President Pastrana quit, there were 2 of us in his cabinet who had studied here in the States. So he called us and he said to us, I need somebody who speaks English, who understands the American culture, who studied there. And so it was between the vice president, who was the previous ambassador, and me. And so he said to the vice president, and he studied where, in Alabama? I don't remember where he studied, in Arkansas or somewhere yet. Anyway, and so he said to me, you know what, I need the vice president, because he helped him with all the human rights issues. He said, and so Carolina, I would like for you to go to the US. So when I got here, some of my friends in the Congress would say, is this a promotion? To which I always said, of course, being the ambassador to the US is a promotion. But it was a lot of hard work, and for something that was so important that I really felt very, very motivated. But I have never worked so hard in my life because it was a difficult moment. Labor unions, you had already passed the free trade agreement with Peru. CAFTA, that went that passed with only one vote. These countries that were no threat to the US. They were such small countries that you were going to help, and yet it passed by only one vote, just to tell you how negative the environment was for free trade agreements. And so Peru managed to pass, and then came Colombia. And the labor unions were very much against it. So during my 4 years that I took down 91 congressmen, that I visited with them all the time. Every 6 months they'd see me again and they'd say, Carolina, we have nothing new to... I said, but just let me tell you what's going on. And so we would have a conversation. It didn't pass on my ward. But then when the next ambassador came up 2 years later, the US was very interested in signing the free trade agreement with Korea. And so the Speaker of the House said to President Obama, I have no problem in presenting the free trade agreements, but they will go in the order we receive them. Colombia first, Panama second, and Korea third. So in 2012, 6 years after we had finished signing it, in a very civilized 4 hours, it passed through the House. It sent up to the Senate. It was passed by the Senate, and so we've had a free trade agreement that that has been working since 2012. So that's how I got here. and I must say it was very, very interesting. For me, it was very interesting also to see how your government works, because an ambassador here has to work with the executive, but has to work very hard with the legislative part. The judicial, less, but then there are the NGOs with whom I had to work a lot. The think tanks are very important here. And then visiting the different parts of the country, because there were, in some places, in California, they were worried about the flowers, and yet in other places they were very happy about being able to sell pork. So I learned a lot about the US because I had to go to different places and understand the markets and who were those who were going to support us and those who were not so happy, so that we could talk about the problems. So they were fascinating 4 years in which I got to see a lot of the US and learn a lot about your system. It was fantastic.
Good afternoon. I'm really excited with your presentation. My name is Vanessa. I'm also from Colombia.
Qué gusto, Vanessa.
Yeah, qué gusto. So I am interested, as I think most of the Colombian people, in the peace process right now, because it is a huge thing going on in Colombia. And among all the great things that we have reached, there is now a really hard situation related with human rights and increasing murders of social leaders. And that's related with some other and various armed actors that we have in the country, such as another guerrilla, paramilitary groups, or criminal bands. And so I would like to hear your thoughts regarding those armed actors, because they were not the primary object in the Plan Colombia, but now, and I think that historically in Colombia they have been really, really important in the social and economic dynamic.
Absolutely. Well, this is what we were talking about, the fact that making a peace agreement work is always very, very challenging, because you have all these areas that were controlled by these guerrillas, whatever group it was, that the government then has to come in immediately to offer security, because in a way the FARC were the ones ruling in those areas, and these areas are areas that are of interest to other drug traffickers or other guerrillas, smaller ones, other illegal groups. Then, if we all know the saying, if there's a vacuum, it gets filled. And if the government didn't fill the vacuum, we knew it was going to get filled, because there was a lot of it. These are very attractive areas, because drug trafficking continues to be so lucrative. So this is why it has been so difficult. The government is trying to reach there. And when you get And so the human rights problems need to be addressed in various ways. One, we need to understand better who it is that's going after, in the different cases, understanding better what happened. Why was this person attacked? Why was this person killed, which is terrible? But understand better what it was that led to that, to see what kind of measures. Did you need to have given them more protection? Or is this a problem of a fight? Many times it has to do with other issues, that there's a fight going on between two groups and this person got stuck in the middle. No, you don't want to have any one of these cases, but when you have these areas where there's so much violence, there are innocent people that get caught up and then people who are targeted. And that's what we need to understand and address. I always found these conversations about human, and when we were getting the free trade agreement, the concern was with labor union members. In Colombia, all the teachers are labor union members, all of the members of our councils are considered, of the city councils are considered labor union members, etc. So many of them were targeted because they were labor union, but many of them were targeted because they were in a violent area. And that doesn't excuse it, but it is important to understand, and it's important to understand what the government is trying to do and try and see what you can do better. But there are many of these situations which get out of your control because these are areas that still have all this violence related to all that illegality that is taking place. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's just not so white, and it's just because these areas have so many difficulties and all these cross currents and still the violence. So until we can get the state presence there and control it, and understand better also when there are these moments that a group is being targeted, to offer them better security. It's fundamental, and it's something we need to keep on addressing every single day.
Hi, my name is Izzy. Again, thank you for coming. So I kind of have two questions, and you can choose to answer one or the other. But I'm curious to know if FARC had any representation in the Colombian government, like as a political party, and then additionally, what the current status of the diplomatic relations between Colombia and Venezuela in aspect to the.
None. But so that one was very easy, but very hard. Very hard. It's too bad because we don't even have consular representation. We have other countries are taking care of our consular problems for Colombians who might be left still in Venezuela. And I think we're going to have to see at one point how we can start talking, but at this moment it has been impossible. Because Venezuela's tried to sit down to advance in negotiations, and then they were going to have, they were advancing in negotiations, and Colombia was trying to see what we could do. But then they caught Alex Saab, who's a Colombian, who was somebody very close to Maduro, who managed all his finances, who got all them, well, in fin, knows all his finances, his banking, etc. And the U.S. asked for extradition. Alex Saab has just been sent to the U.S., and Colombia supported that and sent all kinds of information. So, of course, our relationship is once again in minus whatever. But your other question was about the FARC. So the FARC had made an agreement. So when my father came in 1986, we'd had a president before called Belisario Betancourt. He had reached an agreement with part of the FARC, and they had organized into a party called La Unión Patriótica, UP. And so when my father started in 1986, some of the members of the UP were mayors of their municipalities, some were justices, etc., and they came in. But other members went back, and there was paramilitary groups started killing many of them. So when you get all these illegal groups, you get all these, when there's that fight for control of land, then many times you get the left, for example, the guerrillas who would come in, take over the lands of cattle owners. So the cattle owners would organize and they'd form paramilitary groups, go in and they fight. If you don't have a strong government, like we didn't have in those areas, this is what happens. You have different forces trying to take control, and you end up with these kind of situations of incredible violence. That's why it's so important for the government to continue to be able to take control of all of the land. Then, now within the agreement, the FARC were allowed to have 8 positions in Congress. You might remember. So for 2 periods, 8 members of the FARC could sit in Congress, and then they had to be elected. This was part of what was agreed. And they have been participating in the elections that we've had. They have won a few mayorships, but not much. I think they were very surprised to see what little support they had, because the FARC at the end had become just like another drug trafficking group, and they'd lost all contact really with the people, with the campesinos. So in fact, they are not very popular. They have not done well in the elections. We'll have to see how this moves forward. But yes, as part of the agreement, they were given positions so that, because what you do in one of these peace agreements is say, okay, don't fight with your arms, come in and fight within the system with democratic rules and by getting elected. So that's where we are.
Thank you.
I have a question a little bit off that. So this whole conversation has been really interesting because I'm actually doing a project on the park right now, so this is very helpful. And I was wondering, one of the elements of Plan Colombia is talking about institutions and institution building. And actually, I had the chance to talk with Ivan Duco this past summer, and I asked him a similar question about like, what is that pathway to kind of consolidate Colombia as a democracy a little bit more and kind of eradicate those human rights issues. And he said a similar thing about building local institutions, but he didn't really give an answer as far as what the path is to do that. And so, like as part of Plan Colombia, what is the path or what is the avenue to build local institutions? Is it with the military, or is it by example, or what is the pathway to that?
The pathway, I think there are many elements to it. So one is building roads. So right now we're putting an incredible amount of one of our largest tranches of our budget is going to building roads. Colombia we need to have access to our different parts, so that is fundamental. These are the main roads, we're talking about major roads. And with monies that we're getting from oil, the royalties, that we're building then tertiary roads also, so that these main roads then reach out. But the other tranche that we're working on is addressing the issues of social inequality. So our second, I don't know if it's the first or second, other tranche has to do with education. We are investing in education because we think it's very important that we reach out. And also in cadastres, in making sure that people have land titles and titling land. There are areas that we have more than 10 million hectares that were abandoned when the violence, people who had farms, etc., who stopped going, left it, and many of these lands were abandoned. Others have come back, so there are different titlings there, and the government has gone in to fix all that because we think it's very important that the way of taking over is also giving people a stake in their area and where they want to be, and so we're working on that. Another are economic programs and justice. Justice is absolutely fundamental, and right now we have to really work towards that reconciliation. We have to continue working with victims. We have to see how we can reintegrate the FARC The truth is that it's, yes, between 15 and 20% have gone back, which is sort of, unfortunately, sort of the normal of these agreements. But the others, up to recently, have expressed their commitment to staying within the system, have found that they have been well received, and many of the leaders, 2 of them went back to the guerrilla. So I think that the challenge is to continue progressing and taking services to these different communities. What they tried to do with the program that I showed you, the PEDETs, the 16 areas that were prioritized, was that they decided that with these money, this was done with the budget, the national budget also, was to get the communities to say what they wanted. That is very effective from a democratic buying into the system. When you look at all the projects, maybe they don't add up as much as if you had planned it in a way that it would be more complementary. But maybe at this moment, what you really needed was for people to feel that the government was responding to their needs. So all these decisions that you make as a policymaker, nothing's perfect. And so you just have to measure and see how it goes. And in this case, for example, when they had the communities come in and decide on what projects they wanted, sometimes they really didn't add up at all. I mean, they wanted a little bit of a road over here and another little bit over there and then a market over here. And so you have to sit down and say, look, don't you think it would make more sense, since we all go to this one place, if we made a bigger market and we worked on this? And this is part of the challenges and of, I think, what can also be very rewarding of public service, which I hope all of you will try in different forms, because it can be as an NGO in the private sector, and so many different ways. But it's challenging, but I think Colombia is going forward. It's difficult. We've had social unrest also, because young people, as in other places, COVID has made it difficult for all of us. And for a country like mine, where 50% of people are in the informal sector, and you're saying you have to stay home. If you're in the informal sector, you're out on the street or you don't eat. So people would go in, but they would go out, but couldn't find anything. So we've had to increase subsidies, so the government has an incredible deficit. And young people then aren't finding jobs. They feel the education is not as good as they want. So I think we're all sort of facing these different challenges that we're going to have to address and decide. But for Colombia, I think keeping very clear that we have to work on those inequalities that we have in our system is absolutely fundamental. I think that is the way, and youth. Young people have to feel that there's a place for them, that they can get ahead, and that the country is there for them, and that they want to be invested in the country. So I think that's where we have to focus our greatest efforts.
You had a question? You put your hand up before and I'll come back.
Yes, so I was just wondering, some aspects of Peace Colombia, like the Victim Compensation Plan for Victims of Violence, have been really long and difficult processes. What can or should the U.S. government be doing to provide additional support to Colombia to help fulfill all of the aspects of Peace Colombia?
I think, well, the Kroc Institute is doing a follow-up to see what was going on. And yesterday that I met with our ambassador, he was getting a report of what programs they felt were going well, where there were problems. So I think helping us with these analysis, understanding where the problems are is very, very helpful. And then I think there's a constant conversation about how to best use these monies. But I think a lot of it has to do with understanding where the difficulties are, and then which are the priorities. But yes, no, this whole issue of the victims, I mean, there were so many victims, there were so many years that, this is part of the ongoing process. And that's why that whole part that has to do with getting the memory, understanding what happened, this jurisdiction, the special jurisdiction, peace jurisdiction, the FARC have to go in and confess what they did and tell their story. And the victims are there so that they can listen to what's going on and they can also challenge them. So in a way, as you also heard in South Africa, this kind of conversation becomes absolutely fundamental if we are going to be able to reach some levels of reconciliation and some levels of understanding, which is what we need, because the country is very divided, and what we need to do is have these spaces where we can all sit down and talk and work on these issues.
I know that we could have lots more questions, and with apologies, but we are over the time allotted, so we wanted to just please join me in thanking Ambassador Barco one more time.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of special gifts for you from the Maaspacher Institute to thank you for the time you spent with us. This has been really amazing, and we hope that you will feel at home here.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. No, thank you all for your patience, and please ask Professor Robertson if any of you want to get in contact, you'd like more information, if I can be of any help, let me know. Be delighted. I think it's very, very important to understand better what's going on and have the different perspectives, so I'd be delighted. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.